The studio lights gleamed as the cameras rolled on late-night spotlight, the domain of Fiona Carrington, a sharp-tongued, fearless journalist known for her no-holds-barred takedowns of politicians, celebrities, and cultural icons. With her biting wit and unapologetic progressive stance, Fiona had built a reputation for cutting her guests down to size, much to the delight of her devoted audience. So when someone on her production team floated the idea of inviting Clint Eastwood, the room buzzed with excitement. The Hollywood legend, known for his rugged roles and old-school charm, was also a figure of controversy due to his conservative views. To Fiona, this wasn't just another interview. It was an opportunity, a chance to challenge what she saw as outdated ideals personified by the man himself. Fiona threw herself into preparation, combing through Clint's past interviews and movies, sharpening her lines with a mix of humor and critique. She could already imagine the audience roaring with laughter as she delivered her perfectly timed jabs. Meanwhile, miles away in Carmel, California, Clint sat in his sunlit kitchen, reading the invitation over a cup of black coffee. His assistant Jack studied him carefully before speaking. "Are you sure about this? Fiona Carrington isn't exactly friendly territory," Jack cautioned. Clint smirked, his weathered face unreadable. "Friendly or not, a conversation is a conversation. People can say what they want. It doesn't change the truth." Jack wasn't convinced. "She's going to come after you. Politics, your movies, probably even your age." Clint shrugged. "Let her. It's not about winning or losing. It's about showing up." As the days counted down, Fiona's team meticulously crafted her questions, ensuring each one was loaded with irony and humor. Clint, on the other hand, carried on with his usual routine, refusing to rehearse. He trusted his instincts. Whatever happened, he'd handle it. When the night finally arrived, the late-night spotlight studio buzzed with anticipation. Fans filled the seats, eager to see how this face-off would unfold. Backstage, Fiona rehearsed her monologue one last time, savoring the sharp barbs she had lined up. "Tonight's going to be legendary," she said to her head writer, Veronica. "It'll be a ratings hit for sure," Veronica agreed. "Clint's the perfect guest. Everything your audience loves to critique. Just don't give him too much room to respond." Fiona smirked. "He's 94. He's not exactly going to keep up with me." Meanwhile, Clint arrived without fanfare, dressed simply in a tailored blazer and jeans. His quiet confidence turned heads as he walked toward the green room, Jack trailing behind, still nervous. "Last chance to back out," Jack muttered. Clint chuckled. "You worry too much. It's just a conversation." As Fiona stepped onto the stage, the audience erupted in applause. In the green room, Clint sipped his water, watching the monitor as Fiona launched into her monologue. "Look at that crowd," Jack whispered. "They're eating out of her hand already." Clint leaned back in his chair, eyes steady on the screen. "That's her job," he said simply. "Mine is to tell the truth. Let's see what happens." And with that, the showdown was set. Neither Fiona nor Clint had any idea just how much this night would change them, or the conversation it would ignite across the nation. Clint Eastwood gets mocked on live TV, but his unshakable response leaves everyone stunned. The crowd erupted in laughter as Fiona Carrington, the reigning queen of late-night sarcasm, delivered another cutting remark. Clint Eastwood, an icon of Hollywood, a relic of old-school masculinity, and a man who still thinks talking to an empty chair is good entertainment. Applause and cheers rippled through the audience as Fiona smirked, clearly pleased with their reaction. With her signature wit, she launched into a flurry of jabs about Clint's films, his politics, and even his age. Backstage, Clint watched the spectacle unfold with mild amusement. His face remained unreadable, but his assistant Jack shifted uneasily. She's laying it on thick, Jack muttered. Clint gave a slow nod. She's doing her job. Let her have her fun. When Fiona finally introduced Clint, the applause was a mix. Some cheers, a few scattered boos. Unbothered, Clint strolled onto the stage, shook Fiona's hand firmly, and tipped his hat to the audience. The gesture earned a few chuckles and even a smattering of claps. "Mr. Eastwood, welcome to the show," Fiona said, her tone light but laced with an edge. "Thanks for having me," Clint replied, voice steady. "Nice crowd you've got here." The tension was palpable as Fiona leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "Oh, they're great. They love a good debate. Ready to dive in?" Clint smiled faintly. "Always." And with that, the verbal duel began. Fiona wasted no time. "Clint, you've had a pretty long career, over 6 decades, right? That's impressive. Ever think maybe it's time to let the younger generation take the reins?" The audience chuckled, clearly on Fiona's side. Clint tilted his head slightly, considering the question. "Well, Fiona," he said in his gravelly voice, "I've always believed work isn't about age. It's about what you bring to the table. Whether you're 25 or 94, if you have something worth saying or doing, why stop?" A few polite claps followed, but Fiona wasn't about to let up. "Sure, but times change, don't they?" she pressed. "Your early films, they're classics, no doubt, but let's be honest, they're not exactly known for their progressive representation of women or minorities. Do you ever feel like those old-school values you portrayed just don't hold up anymore?" The audience roared with laughter and applause. Fiona leaned back, satisfied. Clint remained unfazed, his expression calm. "Films are a reflection of their time," he said steadily. "They capture what people were thinking, feeling, and struggling with. Sure, some things don't age well, but that's true of anything in life. Progress isn't about erasing the past. It's about learning from it." The laughter quieted as the audience took in his words. Sensing a shift, Fiona quickly changed gears. "Fair point," she conceded with a shrug. "But let's talk politics. You've been pretty vocal about your views, and let's just say they don't exactly align with, well, a lot of this audience. Do you ever worry that being so outspoken might alienate the people who used to admire you?" Clint met her gaze, his smile faint. "I've always believed in being honest about who I am and what I stand for. If that means some people don't like me, so be it. Integrity isn't about being popular. It's about standing by your principles even when it's not convenient." A murmur ran through the crowd, part agreement, part skepticism. Fiona, determined to regain control, leaned in. "But don't you think that kind of stubbornness makes you seem out of touch?" she asked, voice dripping with mock concern. "I mean, the world's moving forward and some might say you're clinging to the past." Clint chuckled softly, his eyes twinkling. "You call it clinging, I call it staying grounded. The world moves fast, Fiona. But sometimes, in its rush to change, it forgets the value of what came before." A hush fell over the studio. For the first time that night, the audience wasn't laughing. Fiona faltered slightly, sensing the shift. "Fair enough," she said, recovering quickly. "But surely you can admit there's room for improvement in the way things used to be done?" "Of course," Clint replied smoothly. "There's always room for improvement. But improvement doesn't mean tearing down the foundation. It means building on it. You can't write a new chapter if you're too busy ripping out the old pages." The same audience that had cheered Fiona's earlier jabs now sat in thoughtful silence. Even Fiona, usually lightning fast with a comeback, hesitated. The exchange continued. Fiona firing off sharp questions, Clint countering with calm, measured responses. The contrast between them was striking, one fueled by energy and provocation, the other by quiet conviction. Slowly but surely, the balance of power on stage began to shift. The audience, once firmly on Fiona's side, started seeing Clint in a different light. By the end of the segment, Fiona's once effortless humor felt forced, while Clint's authenticity resonated. This wasn't just an interview anymore, it was a moment. Clint Eastwood faces a fiery interview, but his unshakable response leaves everyone silent. Fiona leaned in, her smile playful but razor-sharp. "Let's talk about those westerns," she said, her voice dripping with mock curiosity. "Do you ever feel like the characters you played, tough guys with guns solving problems with violence, might have contributed to some of the, let's say, less than healthy ideas about masculinity we see today?" The audience roared, clapping and cheering at the well-crafted jab. Fiona sat back, basking in the energy of the room. This was her element, poking the bear and watching it dance. Except Clint Eastwood didn't dance. Instead, he gave a small nod, his lips curling into a faint, knowing smile as he let the laughter die down. Then, with the same calm authority that made his characters legendary, he spoke. "Well, Fiona," he said, voice steady and deliberate, "it's easy to look at things through the lens of today and forget what they represented back then. Those characters weren't just tough guys with guns, they were symbols of resilience, independence, and the fight for justice in a world that didn't always play fair. If that's toxic, then I guess we've got different definitions." The laughter stopped. The shift in the room was almost audible as curiosity replaced amusement. Fiona blinked, momentarily caught off guard. She hadn't expected him to meet her sharp criticism with such steady conviction. She recovered quickly. "That's an interesting take," she said, crossing her arms. "But surely you can admit that some of those films glorified violence, right? Don't you think that sends the wrong message, especially to younger audiences?" Clint leaned forward slightly, clasping his weathered hands together. "Violence is a part of life, Fiona. Always has been. But those stories weren't about glorifying it. They were about confronting it. They were about characters making hard choices in a tough world. Life isn't clean or simple, and sometimes you have to face the ugliness head-on to protect what matters." The weight in his voice silenced the audience. Some nodded, others just listened, drawn into his quiet conviction. Fiona, sensing the shift, decided to pivot. "Fair enough," she said with a tight smile. "But let's move on from the past. Let's talk about now. You've been pretty vocal about your political views, some would say controversial. Do you think that's hurt your legacy, alienated fans who used to admire you?" Clint sat back in his chair, thoughtful but unbothered. "Maybe it has," he admitted. "But I've never been interested in being popular, Fiona. I've been interested in being honest. You can't please everyone, and if you try, you'll lose yourself in the process. My views aren't meant to make people happy. They reflect what I believe is right, and that's all any of us can do." For a moment, Fiona hesitated. Her usual strategy of turning a guest's words against them wasn't working. Clint wasn't defensive, wasn't flustered. Instead, he answered her questions with a quiet sincerity that was starting to win over the room. Deciding to take a risk, Fiona leaned in. "You seem pretty comfortable with who you are," she said, her tone softening just slightly. "But don't you think there's value in evolving, in letting go of old ideas and embracing new ones?" Clint's eyes met hers, steady and unyielding. "Of course there is," he said. "But evolution doesn't mean abandoning your roots. It means understanding them, learning from them, and carrying forward what's worth keeping. The problem with the world today is too many people want to tear everything down without thinking about what they're building in its place." The silence that followed was profound. Even Fiona, who had built a career on sharp comebacks, seemed at a loss for words. The energy in the room had changed. Clint glanced at the crowd, his expression softening. "Look, I get it," he said. "I'm old and my views might seem outdated to some of you. But here's the thing. Life's not about being right all the time. It's about being true to yourself, even when it's hard, and it's about listening, even when you disagree." A young woman in the front row wiped away a tear. The audience, which had been so quick to laugh and cheer earlier, now sat in contemplative silence. Even Fiona looked momentarily humbled, her usual bravado replaced by a hint of introspection. Clint let the moment breathe before speaking again. "Mind if I tell a little story?" he asked, his voice cutting through the quiet like a warm knife through butter. Fiona hesitated, then nodded. "Go ahead," she said, her voice softer now. And as Clint began to speak, the dynamic in the studio shifted completely. Clint Eastwood on resilience, purpose, and staying true to yourself. Clint leaned back in his chair, his voice calm yet steady. "You know," he said, "when the roles didn't come, I didn't sit around waiting for Hollywood to call. I built furniture, taught myself to work with my hands. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept me going." Fiona, usually quick to interject, found herself uncharacteristically silent. There was something in Clint's voice, a quiet sincerity, that made interruption feel out of place. "And then one day I got lucky," he continued, a faint smile crossing his lips. "A small studio needed someone to play a cowboy. They didn't think much of me, but I had the right look and the right price. They didn't have to pay me much." The audience chuckled softly, drawn in by his self-deprecating honesty. "That's how I landed Rawhide," he said. "It wasn't a big deal at the time, just another TV show, but for me, it was everything. It was a chance to prove I could do this. So I gave it my all." He paused, his gaze distant, as if reliving those early days. The funny thing about opportunities is they don't come with guarantees. You get your shot, and it's up to you what you do with it. I worked harder than ever, not because I wanted fame or money, but because I wanted to respect the chance I'd been given. And slowly, things started to change. I learned, I grew, I got better. The room, once filled with laughter and energy, was now hushed, hanging on his every word. Even Fiona, her usual sharpness dulled by something deeper, found herself leaning in. Clint's tone deepened. "But Hollywood," he said, "it tests you. Success doesn't mean the challenges stop. If anything, they get harder. People try to shape you, tell you what you can and can't do. I had to fight to stay true to myself. There were times I turned down roles, even when I needed the money, because they didn't feel right. I wasn't interested in being someone else's idea of a star. I just wanted to do good work and be honest about who I was." He looked out at the audience, his expression calm but firm. "And you know what I learned? Integrity isn't about the big moments. It's about the small ones. The times when no one's watching, and you still do the right thing. The times when you choose the hard road because it's the right one. That's what's kept me going all these years." A young man in the crowd nodded, his face thoughtful. A middle-aged woman in the front row wiped her eyes. Clint's words weren't just a recollection of his life. They were a reflection of choices and struggles that resonated with everyone in the room. Fiona cleared her throat, her voice quieter than before. "That's quite a journey," she said, the edge in her tone noticeably absent. "But surely there were times you doubted yourself, times when you wanted to give up?" Clint nodded, his face softening. "Of course. Everyone has doubts, Fiona, but doubt isn't a sign to stop. It's a sign to keep going. And if you stay true to yourself, the path becomes clear, even if it's not easy." A heavy silence settled over the studio, Clint's words landing like a gentle but undeniable truth. For the first time, Fiona leaned back, momentarily unsure of what to say next. The show had started as a playful sparring match, but Clint had done something remarkable. He had turned a conversation meant to challenge him into one that made people reflect. As the segment ended and the cameras signaled a commercial break, the audience erupted in applause, not the polite, obligatory kind, but the real, heartfelt kind reserved for moments that truly matter. Clint, ever humble, gave a small nod, his smile barely there, but genuine. And in that moment, Fiona realized something. This wasn't going to be the takedown she had envisioned. Clint Eastwood wasn't just an aging actor with outdated ideas. He was a man who had lived, fought, and endured, and had come out the other side with a wisdom that was impossible to ignore. Clint Eastwood on purpose, resilience, and staying true to yourself. "You don't find purpose overnight," Clint said, his voice steady, yet thoughtful. "Sometimes it takes years, sometimes it changes, but the key is to keep moving. Do the work even when it feels pointless. Show up even when it's hard, and pay attention because the answers are often in the things you overlook. It's in the people you meet, the opportunities you almost miss, the challenges you think you can't handle. Purpose isn't something that's handed to you. It's something you build, piece by piece." A young man in the audience nodded, his face reflective. In the back row, a woman discreetly wiped her eyes, clearly moved. Fiona, sensing the shift in the room, realized something. Clint wasn't just talking to her. He was speaking to everyone. "That's a powerful perspective," she admitted, her usual sharpness replaced by something softer, more genuine. "But let's bring it back to you for a moment. You've faced criticism, setbacks, even failure. How do you keep going when the world feels like it's against you?" Clint chuckled, the sound low and warm. "You keep going because you have to," he said simply. "Because the alternative is giving up. And that's not who I am. Look, Fiona, the world isn't always fair. It's not always kind. But that doesn't mean you stop fighting for what matters. You don't have to win every battle. Sometimes just showing up is enough." The simplicity of his words struck a chord. Fiona, who had entered this conversation with a touch of skepticism, now found herself seeing him in a new light. He wasn't just an old-school actor or a relic of a bygone era. He was a man who had lived, struggled, and learned, and the wisdom he carried was undeniable. As Clint spoke, the audience's energy shifted. The playful jeers and laughter that had greeted Fiona's opening remarks had given way to something quieter, more contemplative. The air in the studio was charged with emotion, a shared sense of introspection settling over the crowd. "And let me tell you something else," Clint added, his voice taking on a firmer tone. "Resilience isn't just about the big moments. It's in the small ones too. It's in the times when you bite your tongue instead of lashing out, when you choose to listen instead of argue, when you do the right thing even when no one's watching. Those small moments add up. They shape who you are." The audience erupted into applause, not the wild, enthusiastic kind that followed Fiona's usual sharp-witted exchanges, but something deeper, more heartfelt. Clint nodded slightly, acknowledging the response with quiet gratitude. Fiona glanced at her notes and suddenly realized they didn't matter anymore. The scripted questions she had planned felt irrelevant in the face of the conversation unfolding before her. She closed her folder and met Clint's gaze. "I have to admit," she said, her voice tinged with admiration, "I didn't expect this conversation to go the way it has, but I'm glad it did." Clint smiled faintly. "Life's full of surprises, Fiona," he said. "Sometimes you just have to go with it." The cameras panned across the audience, capturing their quiet, thoughtful expressions. It was clear Clint's words had landed, not just with Fiona, but with everyone in the room. Resilience, as he had so eloquently put it, wasn't about being unbreakable. It was about learning to bend without breaking, about standing up again and again, no matter how many times life knocked you down. Fiona shifted slightly in her chair, no longer leaning forward with the predatory confidence she had displayed at the start. Clint, still calm and composed, had subtly taken control of the room, not with bravado, but with authenticity. The audience, captivated, hung on his every word. "So, Clint," Fiona said, her voice gentler now, "you've talked about resilience and purpose, but let's dig a little deeper. You've made some tough choices throughout your career, turned down roles, faced criticism, gone against the grain. What drove those decisions? Was it stubbornness or something else?" Clint chuckled, shaking his head. "People like to call it stubbornness," he said, his eyes twinkling with quiet amusement. "But I call it integrity. It's about knowing who you are, what you stand for, and refusing to compromise on that, no matter how tempting it might be." The word hung in the air. Integrity. Fiona tilted her head, intrigued. "But isn't there a cost to that?" she pressed. "Staying true to yourself is admirable, sure, but what about the opportunities you lose, the people you alienate? Doesn't it get lonely?" Clint paused, considering her question. "There's always a cost," he admitted. "But the cost of losing yourself is far greater. I've seen too many people in this industry, and in life, give up pieces of themselves to fit in, to be liked, to succeed. And maybe they get what they wanted in the short term, but in the long run, they end up empty, because when you lose your integrity, you lose the thing that makes you. The audience sat in silent reflection, his words sinking in. Fiona nodded slowly, sensing the weight of his statement. "Can you give us an example?" she asked, her voice softer now. Clint leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "Early in my career," he began, "I was offered a big role. It would have paid well, and it could have put me on the map. But the character they wanted me to play? He was someone I didn't respect. His actions went against everything I believed in. I needed the money, I wanted the exposure, but something in me said, 'This isn't right,' so I turned it down." Fiona raised an eyebrow. "And how did that work out for you?" Clint smiled faintly. "Not great at first," he admitted. "I struggled for a while after that, but eventually another opportunity came along, one that aligned with my values. And because I had stayed true to myself, I was ready for it. If I had taken that first role, I might have made some quick cash, but I wouldn't have been proud of what I was putting into the world. And that matters to me." The audience, once eager to cheer for Fiona's clever jabs, now sat in thoughtful silence. Clint's story was more than just a reflection on his past. It was a lesson in the power of principle, in knowing what you stand for and refusing to trade it away for convenience. Fiona, ever the skeptic, exhaled. "But Hollywood's not exactly known for rewarding integrity," she said after a moment. "Don't you think that kind of idealism is, well, a bit outdated?" Clint leaned back in his chair, a knowing smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Maybe," he said, "but that doesn't mean it's wrong." Expression remained calm but firm. "Maybe it is," Clint said. "But that doesn't make it any less important. Integrity isn't about being rewarded, it's about being able to live with yourself. It's about looking in the mirror and knowing you did the right thing, and that's not outdated, that's timeless." A young woman in the audience discreetly wiped away a tear, her face a mix of admiration and self-reflection. A man near the back nodded, his expression thoughtful. Clint's words weren't just landing, they were resonating, stirring something deeper in the crowd. Fiona shifted in her seat, feeling the weight of the moment. "It sounds like you've never doubted your choices," she said, trying to regain some footing. "But surely there were times when you wondered if it was worth it?" "Of course," Clint admitted without hesitation. "I'm human, Fiona. There were moments I questioned myself, wondered if I was being too stubborn or idealistic, but every time I reminded myself why I started, because success without integrity isn't really success, it's just an illusion, and that always brought me back to center." The crowd erupted in applause, not the loud, performative kind from earlier, but something deeper, more heartfelt. Clint acknowledged it with a small nod, his face calm yet grateful. Fiona glanced at the audience, sensing the shift in energy. What had begun as a playful, adversarial interview had become something far more profound. She had intended to challenge Clint Eastwood, to frame him as a relic of the past. Instead, he had turned the conversation into a lesson on integrity, self-respect, and standing firm in one's beliefs. As the applause faded, Fiona turned back to him. "I have to admit," she said, her tone unexpectedly genuine, "you've given me, and I think everyone here, a lot to think about." Clint smiled faintly. "That's all I can hope for," he said. "Life isn't about convincing everyone to agree with you. It's about planting seeds and letting people decide for themselves. If my words help someone along the way, then that's enough for me." The cameras zoomed in on Clint's face, capturing his steady, composed expression. The moment felt almost sacred, a rare pause in the rapid-fire world of late-night television. The audience, once eager to laugh at Fiona's sharp jabs, now sat in quiet awe, their skepticism replaced by something else entirely: respect. The energy in the room had shifted. What started as a lively, charged exchange had settled into something softer, more introspective. As the interview continued, Clint's calm presence and heartfelt words had done something unexpected, not just for the audience, but for Fiona as well. "You know," Clint said, breaking the silence after a particularly poignant moment, "it's easy to get caught up in the noise. The world is loud these days, opinions everywhere, everyone shouting to be heard. But the truth is usually found in the quiet moments, when no one's watching." The audience remained utterly still, captivated by the weight of his words. Even Fiona, usually quick with a witty retort, found herself pausing, letting the moment breathe. She glanced at the camera crew, noticing how even they seemed more focused, drawn into the gravity of the conversation. "I've been in a lot of noisy rooms," Clint continued, his voice steady. "Hollywood parties, film sets, political debates. And you know what I've learned? Noise doesn't mean substance. The loudest voice in the room isn't always the one worth listening to. Sometimes it's the quiet ones who have the most to say." Fiona shifted slightly, feeling his words settle over her. For years, she had thrived on being the loudest, using her platform to amplify her opinions, to challenge and provoke. But now, sitting across from Clint Eastwood, she felt a flicker of doubt. Had she been truly listening, or just waiting for her turn to speak? "So, Clint," she said, her voice softer now, "do you think the world has gotten too noisy? Too divided?" Clint leaned back, a faint smile playing at his lips. "The world's always been divided, Fiona," he said. "We just hear more of it now. Technology, social media, 24-hour news. Everyone's got a platform, everyone's talking. But the question isn't about the noise, it's about what you do with it. Are you adding to the chaos, or are you trying to make sense of it?" A murmur rippled through the audience. They weren't just listening, they were absorbing. "And what about you?" Fiona asked, her curiosity now entirely genuine. "You've been criticized for your views, your films, even your age. How do you deal with all of that? Clint's expression softened, a touch of wistfulness in his eyes. You don't let it in, he said simply. The world will always have opinions about you, but at the end of the day, it's your own voice that matters most. If you start letting others define you, you lose yourself. And once you lose yourself, it's hard to get back. A young woman in the front row wiped away a tear, her face a reflection of quiet admiration. A middle-aged man in the back crossed his arms, nodding solemnly. The audience, once so quick to laugh, now sat humbled, listening, truly listening. Fiona glanced at her notes, but suddenly they felt irrelevant. She closed the folder and leaned forward, meeting Clint's gaze. You've lived through so many different eras, she said. Hollywood has changed. The world has changed. Do you think we're moving in the right direction? Clint took a moment to consider, his gaze steady. Progress is important, he said finally. But progress without reflection can be dangerous. You have to know where you've been to understand where you're going. And sometimes, in our rush to move forward, we forget to look back and learn from the past. The studio was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Fiona, usually quick to fill the space, said nothing. The audience, the crew, everyone was simply present. For a man who had spent a lifetime in front of cameras, Clint Eastwood had just done something rare. He hadn't just given an interview, he had given them all something to think about. The audience sat in silence, mesmerized, caught in the gravity of Clint's words. He let the moment linger before speaking again, his voice steady but kind. Look, he said, I'm not here to tell anyone how to live their life. But I will say this, don't let the noise drown out your own voice. Don't let the world rush you into decisions you're not ready to make. And don't be afraid to stand still for a moment, to think, to feel, to listen. That's where you'll find clarity. The applause started softly, almost hesitant, before swelling into something more profound. It wasn't the raucous cheer of an audience entertained. It was something deeper, the response of people moved by something real. Fiona sat back, watching the crowd, her expression thoughtful. As the clapping faded, she turned back to Clint. I'll be honest, she said, her voice quieter than before. I came into this interview thinking I'd be the one asking the tough questions, but you've made me think about things I didn't expect to. Clint gave a faint smile. That's the beauty of a good conversation, he said. It's not about winning or losing, it's about learning. The camera panned across the audience, some smiling, others wiping their eyes, a few simply sitting in quiet contemplation. The energy in the room had shifted completely, transformed by Clint's quiet power and the undeniable truth of his words. Fiona glanced toward her producer, who signaled that the segment was almost over. She turned back to Clint, her voice carrying a newfound respect. Thank you, she said simply, for sharing your story and for reminding us that sometimes the quiet moments matter most. Clint nodded, tipping an imaginary hat. Thanks for having me, Fiona. It's been a pleasure. The cameras cut to commercial, but the studio remained eerily still, the weight of his words lingering long after he had finished speaking. The usual post-show buzz, the laughter, the chatter, the energy, was absent. Instead, there was a subdued stillness, as if everyone was still absorbing what had just happened. The audience slowly rose from their seats, some murmuring to one another, others still lost in thought. Fiona remained at her desk for a moment, staring at her notes. The sharp, biting questions she had carefully prepared now felt hollow, almost meaningless. She glanced at Clint, who was rising from his chair with the kind of deliberate grace that comes with age. As he turned to leave, he gave the audience one last nod, earning a smattering of applause and murmurs of respect. Backstage, crew members and producers approached him hesitantly, their initial skepticism replaced by admiration. A young camera operator, barely out of college, stepped forward, his voice slightly shaky. "Mr. Eastwood," he said, I just wanted to say thank you. What you said tonight really hit home." Clint offered a small smile, his handshake firm but warm. "Glad to hear it, son," he said. "Life's about finding what matters to you and holding on to it. Don't let the world tell you otherwise." Meanwhile, Fiona retreated to her dressing room, her mind racing. The show hadn't gone as planned. It had become something else entirely, something she hadn't anticipated. For years, she had built her career on dominating conversations, outwitting and outmaneuvering even the most formidable guests. But tonight, she had been disarmed. She closed the door behind her and sank into the chair in front of her vanity. The mirror reflected back the same polished image, perfect makeup, composed expression. But inside, something had shifted. She stared at herself, Clint's words echoing in her mind. Was I listening? The question lingered in the air, unsettling in its simplicity. Backstage, Clint was gathering his things when Veronica, Fiona's producer, approached. Her usual confident demeanor was gone, replaced by something more hesitant. "Mr. Eastwood," she began, her voice softer than usual, "I just wanted to say, that was incredible. I don't think we've ever had a guest command the room like that." Clint chuckled, shaking his head. "I wasn't trying to command anything," he said. "Just speaking my truth. People listen when they're ready to hear it." Veronica nodded, respect clear in her eyes. "Well, you definitely gave us all something to think about." Fiona nodded slowly, her mind racing. She had spent so long perfecting the art of cutting through defenses and exposing her guests' flaws that she had forgotten what it felt like to truly listen. Clint hadn't fought back with sharp words or aggression. He had simply spoken his truth. And in doing so, he had shifted the entire dynamic of the conversation. For Clint, the aftermath was quieter, but no less meaningful. Back at his ranch in Carmel, he spent his days as he always did, working with his hands, enjoying the peace of his surroundings, and reflecting on life's simple joys. When his assistant, Jack, showed him the flurry of articles praising the interview, Clint merely chuckled. "Looks like you broke the internet, Clint," Jack said, scrolling through headlines. "People are calling it one of the most powerful late-night interviews in years." Clint shrugged, amused. "It's funny how the simplest things make the biggest noise." "I wasn't trying to break anything, Jack. Just saying what needed to be said." Jack grinned. "Well, whatever you did, it worked. People are calling it a masterclass in authenticity." Clint smirked. Funny how rare that seems to be these days. But the impact of the interview wasn't just online buzz. It sparked real conversations in households, workplaces, and classrooms. A high school teacher in the Midwest played a clip of Clint's monologue for her students, igniting a discussion on values and perseverance. A young entrepreneur in Los Angeles cited Clint's advice about staying true to oneself as the reason he turned down a lucrative deal that didn't align with his vision. The ripples of Clint's words reached further than anyone, Clint included, could have imagined. Fiona wasn't immune to the shift either. A few weeks after the episode aired, she opened her show with something unexpected. "Before we get to tonight's guest," she began, her tone uncharacteristically serious, "I want to take a moment to talk about something that's been on my mind since our last episode with Clint Eastwood. That conversation wasn't just another interview, it was a wake-up call. He reminded me, and I think all of us, of the importance of listening, of being present, and of staying true to who we are. And I want to thank him for that." The audience, surprised but supportive, applauded warmly. It wasn't a flashy, attention-grabbing moment. It wasn't a calculated pivot. It was real. And it felt right. Clint's appearance on Late Night Spotlight would go down in television history, not as a dramatic showdown or a viral meme, but as a rare and profound moment of connection. It was a reminder that even in a world consumed by division and noise, there was still room for quiet strength, for integrity, and for the power of listening. For Fiona, it marked a turning point, one that would shape the way she used her platform in the years to come. For Clint, it was just another day in a long life spent standing by his principles. And for the audience, it was a lesson they wouldn't soon forget, proof that sometimes the quietest voices speak the loudest truths,